So, no sign of a willingness to negotiate from Chuck Schumer there. He is, of course, a Democrat, and the Republican Speaker of the House appears to be equally intransigent.
I've sat down with the president on February 1st. He ignored the rest of the time. He treats it just like the border. He wants to ignore it and thinks it goes away. That doesn't work in America. He's putting the American economy in jeopardy by his lack of action.
Well, for more on this and the other business news of the day, including the fallout from yet another American bank failure, let's bring in Arise Business correspondent Laurie Laird, who is standing by in London. Good to see you, Laurie. A new estimate for X date, and it's earlier than we thought. Why is that?
Charles, is again the day that the U.S. government will not be able to borrow anymore. So we've all been waiting for an estimate of this date. In January, the Treasury thought it could be somewhere between July and September. We've now learned that this date can happen as soon as June 1st. That's less than a month away. And the reason is apparent, and the Treasury hasn't spelled this out, but we can only assume that tax receipts, and most Americans filed their taxes on the 15th of April. We can only assume that those tax receipts were lower than the Treasury had anticipated. Now, that may mean that people earned less, so they're paying less income tax. There are also some extraordinary things that have happened due to storms in various parts of the U.S. People who are affected by those storms were automatically given an extension on their tax returns. So it could be that once those late returns come in, the Treasury has a little bit more time. But we've got a plan for this date. On the 1st of June, the Treasury will not be able to borrow anymore. This is an extraordinary development in the world's most dominant economy.
Well, I mean, it usually gets to the brink and then everyone sort of pulls back. But what happens if Congress and the White House can't find agreement on this debt ceiling?
And I think, Charles, it's right to point out that it does get to the brink, and both sides, the Republicans and the Democrats, do find a way to avert disaster, although we are in a situation where the two sides are so polarized that there are reasons to think that perhaps agreement will be harder to find. At the moment, the markets are assuming there will be a solution. But let's talk about what will happen. The debt ceiling is an arbitrary limit on how much the U.S. can borrow. I'm not aware of any other country that has put this sort of a limit in. Now, America spends, like many countries, spends more than it takes in. It borrows to make up the rest. If it can no longer borrow at a date in the future, let's say it's the 1st of June, that means it has to start prioritizing spending. It cannot meet all of its spending commitments that were met in previous budgets. How will America prioritize? That is the big question. Will it continue to pay out interest on its debt payments? Will it redeem bonds that are maturing? The feeling is that would be how the Treasury would prioritize its spending. But that could mean that military salaries are not paid, that Social Security pension payments are not paid. The Treasury will not have enough money to meet its commitments. So the question will be, what do they decide to pay? If they decide not to honor debt payments, we could have bonds in the world's biggest economy being in default. That's an extreme scenario. But at this point, it's not a scenario that we can rule out.
Well, it all sounds terribly worrying. And all this, of course, happening in the shadow of yet another U.S. bank failure.
That's the thing. It's not as if we don't have some stresses, temporary they may be, in the U.S. economy right now. We had First Republic taken over a small, medium-sized regional bank. In fact, it was at one point the 16th biggest bank in the U.S., taken over by J.P. Morgan very early on Monday morning before it went bust. And the next question is anyone next? Is this a one-off, or could there be some systemic risk here? After all, this is the third bank to fail this year. Now, yesterday was a very big conference in Los Angeles, hosted by, remember, Michael Milken. He was a junk bond trader, actually went to jail. He has rehabilitated himself, and now once a year holds the conference for bankers. And this took place yesterday. And of course, the failure of First Republic Bank was the topic of the day. And there was a very interesting diversion of views at this conference. The heads of the banks all said nothing to worry about here, nothing to see here. Banks are fine. And in fact, this rescue of First Republic actually shows the resilience of the the banking sector. Now, for hedge fund managers and pension fund managers, so in the non-bank financial sector, they were a little bit more concerned about what could happen next, as are some academics. Have a listen to this, Charles.
I am concerned in the longer term about certain problems in the banking system. It looks like the Federal Reserve will probably continue raising interest rates, and that will compound the problem that First Republic Bank faced, where it was earning less interest on its loans than it was paying for its liabilities. We have not totally fixed that problem. In addition, if the U.S. goes into recession, we will probably see higher loan defaults. And so we'll have to keep our eye on that.
Charles, not everybody thinks that the banking sector is completely safe at the moment. And I think one thing that people worry about is loans to commercial property. We know that people aren't going to offices the way they did. So I think that is something to look out for, particularly for regional banks that have a very big exposure to commercial property.
And Laurie, we've got about just under a minute left. This puts the Federal Reserve in a rather tricky position, doesn't it? I mean, there's a key meeting starting today, we understand.
Absolutely, and we'll get the result of whether the Fed will raise interest rates and by how much about 24 hours from now, in fact, 25 hours from now. But the Fed has a difficult thing to weigh up. Inflation is far too high. That would argue for higher interest rates. But we are seeing these problems in the banking sector. Problems in the banking sector may mean that banks are more reluctant to lend. They were going to only lend to the most creditworthy customers. That means less credit in the economy. Does the Fed want to raise interest rates while banks are reining in a little bit? Very big question. A lot for the Fed to weigh up.
Laurie, thanks very much indeed. Laurie Laird, Arise business correspondent, talking to me there from London.